right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our very first podcast, the world premiere of the ET Base, a podcast starring myself, Star, and my good friend, David Steele. Hi, David. How are you?
Great, and how are you, Star?
I'm doing marvelous. Thank you. Yeah, so we had this idea for this podcast to basically document and talk about open contact, first open contact as it's unfolding, because it is unfolding. We both have a lot of experiences ourselves to share within this field. So we figured this might be a really good place to do that. We currently run a lot of Facebook groups that are dedicated to this topic as well. You can find us on Facebook at the First Contact Group. We also deal with a lot of metaphysical things, which we also might discuss in this podcast. Do you have anything else to add to that, David?
Yeah, I would just add that we see all of this as being a bunch of stories. It's a story about, where we are, and we're interested in hearing other people's stories as well and including that in our content. And we're probably also going to get around to talking about things like what are the larger implications of some of this, right? So we are, like I said, like the title says, this is the ET base, but that's the base for exploration. And we'll keep it focused on that, but we'll take forays into other areas that relate to what's relevant to understand in that context and what it means for people, including us, of course. So yeah, that's it. So maybe now is a good time to bounce it over to you and just to give people a bit of sense of who we are, because like I said, if this is a story, then it's good for them to know who we are as individuals, right? So maybe Star, you could spend a little time describing who you are and your background and how that relates to all this.
Sure. So for me, funnily enough, I was never really into ETs or aliens or contact or anything like that. For me, I basically came to America when I was 21. I went to an acting theater school, and I thought at the time that's what I really wanted to pursue. But then my interest completely switched over to metaphysics, you could say. And I got into, various different things, channelings, Bashar, who I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with in this community. Um, just a lot of, seeking yourself, as they say, right? A lot of transforming, that kind of thing. So that was really my main focus, I would say. And I really wasn't even thinking about aliens or ETs or anything like that. In fact, I remember, I think back then, the timeline that Bashar gave us for open contact would be something like 2033 or something, or 33 to 44, something like that. I don't know if you remember that. But anyway, it seemed like it was like still a very long ways away. So I kind of had this mindset back then of like, oh, it'll happen probably in my lifetime, but I wasn't even really focused on it. And then all of a sudden it just like switched, and then it became like the 2026, 27 timeline. And that brought it much closer for me personally, right? So, and yeah, that's how I guess started for me on this whole path. It just kind of came to me. And then I had my own experiences, which we'll talk about next. But yeah, that's how it started for me. So, what about you, David?
Yeah, for me, it's funny because I mean every person has their own way into this, right? When I was a kid, I was fascinated by the unknown and things like that, and I would remember that, my mom would bring home like, papers and tabloids and whatever else. I grew up in Texas, right, in Dallas. For some reason, she was amused by this, even though she was from a strict Catholic upbringing. But it intrigued her, so she would drop these things off, and I would see them on the table in the living room and flip through them, and there would be stuff about, let's say, UFOs and whatever. And I found it fascinating. And my family was open enough that I was allowed to explore these things, even though the my upbringing was kind of strict. And so I went and explored these things and looked at them and was fascinated by, TV shows and things like that as a kid. Like we're talking at a very young age here. But I didn't really know what to do with it. And then at one point I had, well, we'll get to this later, but let's just say that I did have other encounters later that put this all into context. But for me, it was like I didn't really know what to do with all of that. So I just kind of parked it for a while, and then later I came back to it, and we'll get into why and how I came back to it later. But in my life, it was basically something where I was exposed to it at an early age, and then later on, I kind of just grew up and parked it because I didn't know what to do with it in my life. How do you explore this interest in UFOs and ETs? What, how can you deal with that practically? And I think a lot of people struggle with that. And then later, I wound up exploring all sorts of different metaphysical things and self development. And we can get into all that later. But for me, I took a very, very long journey through that, where at the end, I decided to pick up all those things that I had from childhood, which I was fascinated about. And I wound up like you looking at various channelers like Bashar, you mentioned, who's channeled by Daryl Anka, and some other people as well. And that gave me a different perspective on it. And then I had the additional encounters as well, but we can talk about that in a bit. So that's my basic sort of background. But maybe this is a good point, since we're already almost getting on that topic, to bounce it over to you and for you to talk about what got you into this in terms of actual relevant things regarding ET contact, how you got there, and what your encounters and this kind of thing. So maybe speak to that.
For me, it was a couple of different things. I remember it was like the end of 2022. And by then, it was really said like the beginning of the window of open contact was going to be 2023. And all of a sudden, my interest in this whole phenomena kind of peaked out of nowhere. So it's also when I started having some sightings. I was living in LA at the time and I was seeing some very clear, like multicolored sightings quite often. So it just kind of became a lot more real, I think. And then a good friend of mine actually invited me to watch this channeler, right? So who was more focused on open contact and making open contact. So I went there without really thinking much of it. And, you know, they just kind of like introduced this whole world of like, this is really happening and it's right around the corner. And here's how we get you ready for this. So, yeah, I just kind of went with that. And I think that like really solidified my path in it. And then with that same channeler, I actually had like a very public reveal of my own story, of my own galactic family, you could say, which I was completely unaware of before then. So that was like, that just like shifted everything, I guess, for me, because then I knew that like it's not just strangers we're meeting, so to speak, but like all of us have galactic families, like I'm sure you do, David, I do, many other people do. So it was like this, it just took on like a whole other quality to it, if that makes sense. That's just kind of been unfolding for me personally, these ET family relationships, like family connections that I wasn't aware of. So ever since then, I've just kind of been exploring that. I'm still exploring that. I'm still learning about it. But a lot has happened since then, which, that's topic for many other podcasts. Because I've had a lot of encounters, a lot of experiences since then. But for me, it just kind of happened out of nowhere. There was nothing, and all of a sudden this thing was here. And it also became pretty clear like this was going to be a big part of my life going forward. But we can delve into that a little bit later on. How about you? What was it like for you?
So for me, like I said, I had this time in my childhood when I saw things, and then, I didn't use it until later. And what happened was that I realized much later in life that I had actually had encounters as a child. I remember later on there was an incident when I was in my bedroom. In the summertime, we would leave the windows open and with the screens on so that we could get fresh air outside. And I remember there being a something outside with very, very big, sort of glowing eyes looking at me, and quite big. enough that it could stand outside and actually look through the window at me. And I didn't feel any fear. And something in my head told me it was a raccoon. But then later, when I looked at it, it could not possibly have been a raccoon for a lot of reasons. It wasn't the right size, it wasn't the right shape, and it was definitely a full sized being. And I felt this overwhelming urge afterwards just to go back to sleep. And it wasn't until later that I found out that that's actually a very common thing in these kinds of visitation experiences where, you'll see the being and interact with them, and somehow or another your, let's say, fear or whatever else of the unknown is managed. And then you just have this very bizarre idea that instead of being all excited and interested, you just want to go back to sleep again. And I think I had a few of these that I can recall, something of that order. And I didn't really think about it at the time. To me, it was just like it was just some weird experience I was having, which somehow just got put into some part of my memory that just I didn't access. I just kind of didn't look at it. Or maybe I didn't want to look at it at that age. I was pretty young, I would say like 6, 7 years old. And they said that's a common age, actually. And then I had dreams of being meeting certain kinds of beings, I guess you could call like gray beings at that age, and they were very vivid, unlike my other dreams, where I could see myself going up a kind of a ramp and then meeting two different gray beings, one of them taller than the other, and interacting with them at some level. And I don't know what that was about. I never had a regression done or anything, but it was kind of fascinating. The thing was, like I said, I didn't know what to do with that at that time, and I grew up, and I didn't have too many of these encounters. And, when you don't have them every day or whatever, you just say, "Well, that was interesting, and I guess I have to live my life." And I grew up and I went in sort of like the sciences because I still wanted to understand everything. And it wasn't until I got to the other side where I brought this back into my life that I started experiencing these things again. And since then, I've seen things like, and connecting to other kinds of beings, which we can talk about in another episode, like elemental beings. That's a whole other discussion. And I've also had actual encounters seeing ships far more recently, and I think that's because of my awareness of it and my acceptance of having brought it back into my life in that sense. But this is also kind of getting into some of the next part of what we want to discuss, which is like, one thing is that you have the encounters and you have this reveal of, in your case especially, of knowing what it is you're going to be doing at some level. But the next thing, I guess, is to talk about when this happened. What did you do, right? I mean, you know, how did it affect your life afterwards before you really knew what was going on? What was the immediate aftermath of that, and how did you integrate that in your life? So maybe if you could talk a bit about that.
I think that it was just so unexpected for me, honestly, and it kind of shifted it from just an interest or a hobby to something that potentially was really going to be a big part of my life going forward, like part of my life path. I just didn't know what that meant yet, and I still don't know that I do at this point, but it just changed everything, really, right? I mean, it changed, I kind of like it was funny because when this thing happened, I was kind of in the process of like transforming what I thought were the last of my negative beliefs. And I was like, I really don't know what I'm going to do after that. And just like, it's like, what do you do with yourself? And I was thinking like, well, I guess I'll just like live life on earth, the way like they tell you should enjoy it, right? But it just like didn't really seem exciting to me. Like there was nothing really that came to me. But I just went with the flow, I guess. And yeah, and this thing showed up and it just like completely shifted my focus. It shifted my excitement. And yeah, it just almost like became a whole new chapter in life or something. And now I just kind of feel like it's only the beginning of that new chapter, if that makes sense. Obviously, there's a lot of integration you have to do, as you know, I'm sure, with this whole thing. A lot of like that's the thing, right? Is you think like, oh, I'm ready, whatever. They can come for me tomorrow, but obviously you're not ready, right? Otherwise they would have came already. So it's just like this time where everything gets pulled to the surface, a lot of remaining negative beliefs, even limiting beliefs that are not necessarily negative, they get pulled to the surface. Your excitements also somehow become more like noticeable or prominent. Like it's much easier to see what you resonate with, what you don't. There's a lot of shifts that, you can make in your life. I mean, that happened for me. I basically moved like a bunch of times now, completely changed my environment, my relationships, all that kind of stuff. Um, and yeah, even like this whole ET thing, like I think once you start making contact, because that's kind of how they explain it to us, right? It's that you're always already having contact. It's just that you're now becoming aware of it and you're materializing it, right? But I think when you raise your frequency to a certain level, like you also become aware of everything else that's around you as well, not just ETs. So you can tap into, like you said, elementals or ghosts or the spirit realm, right? Like a whole bunch of, other realms essentially that were always there. So it definitely made life a lot more richer, and it definitely takes you out of this bubble of what you think earth life is. And I think we kind of knew, like, obviously there was more, but it's like becoming experiential now. Does that make sense? Like, did you ever experience something like that too?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I said, in childhood, there wasn't so much that I didn't really have the sort of background to figure that all that out, right? So I just kind of parked it. But later, when I brought it back, basically as soon as you get into this, I find the whole idea of ET contact and what it actually represents, and realizing that it's not as simple as you might imagine, that it's not just beings flying in a spaceship from A to B, but that there's more to it. There's things like people talk about things like interdimensionality, and then certain things when you study what's going on, lead you to this understanding that the whole way we conceive of our reality is different than we imagine. I mean, as I began to explore this again and have my own experiences, began to realize that a lot of what I learned in my childhood in terms of how things work, how reality works, what reality even is, they started to just, in the sense that I began questioning and I began realizing that the whole construct was something that just didn't make sense to me. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, what does make sense to me? Because if what I've been taught doesn't describe for me how the world really works, then of course you want to go off and figure out, how does that work? What is really going on? And it changes everything. We'll get into that later about, how it changes your life. But for me, it was a question of questioning everything, realizing that connecting to like these other beings, which I agree completely that you could just do right now. It's happening all the time. You just have to let it in. Opens up the doors to everything that is part of our reality. And like you said, it involves not only things which we consider to be part of the ET realm, aliens and beings of that sort, or interdimensionals even, but everything else, which it turns out is very connected to that: spirits, ghosts, Sasquatch, elementals, fairies. All of these things are very connected to that. Other kinds of high energy beings, even things people would call angels or whatever, those are all connected to that as well in terms of energy. You find this out the more you explore it, and if you're open to that idea. I've always been open minded about this idea that, I don't know what is possible, but I'm willing to explore all these things in the universe and find out, what is really going on, and just be open to whatever presents itself. So that's basically how I put that into context, and that's how I sort of, later on came to grips with it after having a childhood where I just basically didn't know what to do with it. So, but that kind of brings us to the next point, which is, we're talking about like how we deal with things. But I mean, another interesting point is like it's very different if you're an actual experiencer versus those who aren't, and maybe aren't so familiar with this context. And I can imagine, like, for all of us, but let's say for you, let's take your particular example. How did people who weren't so much into this around you react to this? And, did others even listen? And how did that affect you?
I think I've had very different reactions actually. And I find that my circle of friends and family is like very different, very many different groups within that, you could say. So I have a lot of friends like in this community, so obviously they were very much aware of this anyway. They were very excited. They are on their own journey, so we just like obviously exchange information and stories and just, support each other. So that's been really great. And I will say that's like another thing that happened, I think, this past year is like this community has really grown to be like a substantial thing. But then also I've had, I have friends that still have like very fear-based negative belief systems. So the response there was kind of like, well, I hope you know what you're getting involved with, and do you know these people? Can you trust these people? Which is interesting, right? Because it's like they do acknowledge that it exists or that it's real or that it can be real, but they're still on the fence about it. I think like my mom and my parents were kind of like, yeah, whatever, kind of just not really knowing what to say, I think. But interestingly enough, I haven't really had many disbelievers, if you want to call it that. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences that I have shared publicly, and I noticed like I noticed that there's a readiness of people, like they're ready to accept, for instance, like flying saucers, right? Which I have a lot of footage of, and people were like, "Oh yeah, that's cool, that's real." But I actually also have footage of like actual beings that I saw, and people were definitely not ready to accept that yet. But then the more I went along with this path, I think I've also shifted myself to like a different earth where people are more ready and are more willing to accept it. So lately the response has just been like completely positive. Everybody's on board, everybody's excited. So yeah, that's kind of how it's gone for me. What about you, David?
Yeah, in terms of the world around me, like when I was a kid, right, I didn't know what to do with it. And that was probably one of the reasons I didn't really do anything about it. I just, because the world around me was somewhat, I guess, ridiculing at the time. And of course, at that age, I didn't really think so much about it. So it was easier for me just to pack it away. Later on, though, when I unpacked it, I mean, the world was a very different place, right? I was older and things were different. But I would say the average person, when I first talked to them about this, as this became more and more a focus of what I was doing in my life and central to who I am and my experiences, I started to tailor my friends network so that I sort of drifted away from those who didn't feel like this was part of their life or that this made sense to talk about or that it was ridiculous or whatever, to those that took this more seriously. And for me, it was even more specific because I mentioned earlier that I kind of got into a science background because I just wanted to understand how everything works. That was what, I was inspired to understand how everything works when I saw and interacted with these things as a child. So I was very interested in the idea of how these things function mechanically. But then I learned later that there's a spiritual aspect to it all, which I hadn't really anticipated initially, but it makes complete sense later. And then, of course, there's a certain set of people who resonate with that, and then there's others who don't. And so I found that I was dropping out with those people as well and not really having them as friends so much. Not because, we didn't agree on other things, but you want to be honest and authentic in who you are. So that kind of solved itself because, one thing you can do is you can just sort of like clam up and suppress it. And I get people when they want to do that. But it's so nice to realize that there's so many people out there who have similar experiences, not identical, obviously, but of various kinds. And they're out there. They're out there in huge numbers. And these days, there's no reason to keep that to yourself. I know a lot of people these days who are sharing that information. So when I started off, I mean, there was less of that, but now it's changed in the matter of a few years to a point where now I feel like it's life, confirming in a way. It's very reinforcing of the idea that wondrous things can happen in the world. And this is one of them. This is one of them. And it's really spectacular. And if you had asked me many years ago, when I was a teenager, for example, if we would end up in this situation, I probably would have laughed. But now, I'm astonished at how much the world has changed. And it's really affected how I look at things a lot. So maybe this is how we can sort of segue to another thing we wanted to get into, which is like, where are you with this now? I mean, if you look at yourself, right, what's your attitude and your, how do you feel about this whole experience business now in terms of the star you are today?
Well, I think now it's almost like a piece of the puzzle has been unlocked, you could say, or shown. And now it's very clear that I was always on this trajectory. And I think you were as well. A lot of people are, obviously. But it was kind of like, like you said, like I couldn't foresee that this was what was going to happen. But I think now it's very obvious that so Bashar talked about this, like the projection of open contact being around 26 or 27. But before that, there would be these smaller bubble groups that would form that would have individual contacts first, right? So I think obviously you and I are part of that. So that is kind of what I'm doing right now, essentially, is starting those bubbles and growing them, getting a lot of momentum behind it, and just really, really, yeah, doing everything we can to prepare for this, right? So we're doing a lot of energetic work, vibrational work, meditations, and so on. We're doing a lot of belief dropping, transforming work, following our excitements, which has also shifted quite a lot in the past few years. Definitely a lot of personal shifts as well. And also, I think another side effect that I see, especially lately, is like really this idea of the splitting prism taking effect. And it's very clear that people who are on the contact train are really sort of, it's almost like it is its own train, you know what I mean? With its own timeline and its own reality. So that's where I'm at now. And that's really how I foresee that this is going to go. I don't see this stopping until we make contact, and then it'll grow from there as well. So I really see this as like a new age or era that's coming. And I'm sure you can agree with that as well, right?
Absolutely. And just for people who are not familiar with this, the splitting prism idea is the idea that basically act on their highest excitement. Then over time, their realities sort of separate until they're finally in their own separate realities. You hear people talk about different Earths and things like that. So this is kind of an expansion on that concept where you're always splitting off into new realities that reflect what you're doing. And I completely agree with that idea because I feel that you can sense how the world has changed, and the more we act, with actions that support the idea of open contact, the more it feels like we're reinforcing that in our reality. And the things which somehow don't align with that idea for whatever reason seem to be dropping out. And that follows this idea you were mentioning of the splitting prism or the train tracks, which Bashar and some other channelers talk about. It's a very interesting idea, right? And we could have a whole episode about that. Just the idea that in order for us to really live out what our highest excitement is, we have to have an environment which supports that. And getting back to the idea of where I am with this now, I feel like I'm really at home with it. I feel like it it doesn't define me, but it's a part of who I am. It is central to my understanding of what I am because, everybody is unique, and that's a gift, that's a blessing. And appreciating all aspects of that, the more mundane parts, the unusual parts, and like this part, which is, initially was considered very unusual, but now is becoming very common. People every day are talking about this. So, whereas before I didn't really consider this part of who I am, now it's a very central part of who I am. And it has changed me in a whole number of ways, which we can get to in a minute in terms of who I am. It's given me a sort of peace, realizing that this is part of reality because to me reality makes much more sense now. And so maybe that's a good jumping board or springboard to going to the last thing we wanted to cover, which is like how is it really affecting your life path now?
I think that this probably is my life path going forward. And again, it's something that I don't think I was even aware of before any of this happened. Um, for me personally, I'm very clear on that, right? Whether it's working with ETs on Earth or going into space or whatever will happen in the future. I'm not sure. Obviously, I can't answer that now. I will just have to let it unfold, as they say, right? But it has been unfolding. It's almost like it was just there, kind of waiting in the wings, you know? So, again, something that I was completely unaware of, but it is happening. And where it will lead, I don't know exactly. But for me, it's very clear that, like, this is my path and I'm meant to do something with this. I also think I'm meant to sort of put the word out on what's happening on these smaller, more isolated personal contacts, these individual contacts, because they are happening all around us. So that's kind of how I see my path for now, is just sharing this outward. And yeah, and and how it will unfold in the future is, I guess, something we'll have to see. What about you?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, in terms of like path in life, I found that, when you think of ET contact, initially, if you're not really into this, you think that it's just kind of a thing that fits into your normal reality, as I was describing before, and it's just a piece of the puzzle. But when you realize it, it's like getting a puzzle piece which doesn't fit anything. And then you realize the whole puzzle is wrong and you've misunderstood things. It doesn't mean that, what you grew up with was completely wrong, because, that's still a valid way of looking at things for a lot of people. But it makes you look at things in a different way. So the most surprising thing I think about all of it in terms of my life path is that something as unusual, I guess you could say, as ET contact and that sort of phenomena has changed the way I look at everything and also the way I live my life. Because in exploring that, I have explored what it means to interact with those. I've understood the interconnective nature of all different kinds of phenomenon. It's led me to understand and research much more things about things like metaphysics, like, how do people let's say, channelers, teachers, gurus, whoever, explain how reality works. And it's not necessarily what you're taught in school. In fact, it's generally speaking the opposite of that. And once you start replacing these foundational blocks in like who you are, these that describe how you're going to live your life, you can build it up again. And so what I've been doing and listening to channelers and other kinds of people who I resonate with, right? Because there's lots of different material out there, is that I built myself up in a different way so that I realize now what it is I really want to do in life, how I want to pursue that, how I want to actually live from moment to moment in the now moment. And I did not expect that to come out of this phenomenon. I did not expect that to change my perspective on that, but it has. It has, and I'm very grateful for that. It's made a huge difference, and I expect it to be transformational as it continues to be for me. So, in that sense, I would say it's been a complete 100% transformation of basically who I am as a being. I think if you would interact with a version of me from, before all this, significantly before that time, you would find a very different person. You would think it must be an imposter, right? Because I'm so different now. But that's how big the transformation is, and I feel that's also true for you, right?
Even like a year ago, it's a completely different person, you know?
Yeah. So, but yeah, that pretty much summarizes where I am with that, and where I think it's leading, and it's great that you're on such a similar kind of journey with your own path, and I know we interact a lot, so it'll be fun to see how that expands and where that goes in terms of where this journey is, and as we were talking about earlier, it just seems to be accelerating and accelerating into something that within the span of a few years could actually become something very, very momentous in a number of different ways for those of us who are really aligned to this idea. So yeah, so maybe that's really what we wanted to cover today, I guess, and maybe this is a good time to sort of wind that up. So, thank you very much, Star, for this great exchange. I've really enjoyed it, and this on our first episode of this podcast, and we're going to be doing a lot more of these things and having a real blast at it.
Great. Thanks, David. Like David said, we have a lot more to share. This is only the beginning of the beginning. So we hope you tune in next time and we'll see you then.
See you all.